or how to understand the way a society chooses its ways to manage its resources according to social phenomena. Carl Gunnar Peterson was born in Skattungbyn, Sweden, on December 6, 1898. He died on May 17, 1987, in Danderyd, Sweden. His father was a building contractor. At the age of 16, Myrdal dropped his first name and changed his surname from Peterson to the distinctive Myrdal, after the name of his family's farm. For his undergraduate studies, Myrdal attended Stockholm University, where he studied law. He received his law degree in 1923, then went on to study economics at graduate level. Myrdal obtained his PhD in economics from Stockholm University in 1927. In addition to his teaching activities, Myrdal was active in Swedish politics and was elected to the Senate in 1934 as member of the Social Democratic Party. In 1938, the Carnegie Corporation commissioned him to direct a study of the most relevant American problem in those days. In Sweden, in 1942, he was re-elected to the Swedish Senate and was chairman of the Post-War Planning Commission. His political career also included a 2-year stint from 1945 until 1947 as trade minister under a social democratic government. However, he was forced out of office in 1947 as a result of a monetary crisis that was widely blamed on his policy recommendations. After that, he was appointed as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Now, I want to share 3 statements Myrdal produced which seem to me to be very important to understand his work. Quote, "Quantities defined in terms of measurements made at the end of the period in questions are referred to as ex post. Quantities defined in terms of action plan at the beginning of the period in questions are referred to as ex ante." End of quote. Quote, "All sudden and violent changes, whatever their causes or character, must tend to decrease the respect for status quo as a natural order of things." Quote, "People became less inhibited from wanting to change social and economic conditions in a radical fashion according to their own interests, and from being prepared to think of state intervention in ever wider spheres as possible and useful for this purpose." End of quote. Friedrich August von Hayek was born in Vienna, Austria on May 8, 1899. He died on 23 of March 1992 in Freiburg, Germany. Hayek was born in Vienna into an upper-middle-class professional family. His father was a physician and a part-time lecturer in botany, while his paternal and maternal grandfathers were a biologist and a well-known economist, respectively. On his mother's side, Hayek was also a second cousin of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. During World War I, Hayek fought with an Austrian artillery regiment on the Italian front. During the fighting, he sustained damage to his hearing and was later decorated for bravery. After the war, Hayek entered the University of Vienna, where he studied philosophy, psychology, and economics. Hayek decided he was more interested in pursuing a career in diplomacy. He shifted the focus of his studies from philosophy and psychology to political science and law, while continuing to study economics. He received his law degree in 1921 and a second doctorate in political science in 1923. During the late 1920s, with the help of von Mises, Hayek founded a private think tank known as the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. In 1931, however, Lionel Robbins, director of the London School of Economics, invited Hayek to take up a position there. The latter did research and thought at the London School of Economics for nearly 2 decades, until moving to the US in 1950. In 1938, Hayek was granted British citizenship, which he retained until the end of his life. Hayek was married twice and had 2 children by his first wife, a son, Lawrence, who became a distinguished microbiologist, and a daughter, Christine, who was an entomologist employed by the British Museum of Natural History. I want to share 3 statements Hayek produced which seem to me to be very important to understand his work. Quote, "If socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists." End of quote. Quote, "While an equality of rights under a limited government is possible and an essential condition of individual freedom, a claim for equality of material position can be met only by a government with totalitarian powers." End of quote. Quote, "Freedom to order our own conduct in the sphere where material circumstances force a choice upon us, and responsibility for the arrangement of our own life according to our own conscience, is the air in which alone moral sense grows and in which moral values are daily recreated in the free decision of the individual. Responsibility not to a superior, but to one's own conscience, the awareness of a duty not exacted by compulsion, the necessity to decide which of the things one values are to better sacrifice to others, and to bear the consequences of one's own decision, are the very essence of any morals which deserve the name." End of quote. Myrdal's practical achievement was his central role in the creation of the post-war welfare state in Sweden. He was recognized through numerous awards for his work in public policy and economic development. Probably the greatest impact Myrdal has had on the social sciences is his focus and constant demand to draw on all individual and specialized social science categories in order to understand problems such as racism, underdevelopment, and all the problems the developing world faces. He, for instance, urged anthropologists with their holistic knowledge of society and first-hand familiarity with social problems in undeveloped regions to become more involved in economic planning and policy making. In his early work, beginning with his dissertation, Myrdal built on the theory of the cumulative process of price formation and endogenous money. In lectures in Stockholm University published in 1939 as Monetary Equilibrium, Myrdal articulated the distinction between ex ante, that is planned, and in the late 1930s, Myrdal changed gears regarding savings. The landmark study for the Carnegie Foundation, An American Dilemma, published in 1944, was a pioneering investigation in sociology. From then on, his career was marked by a unique blending of sociological and economic reasoning. In 1968, based on similar economically informed sociological principles, Myrdal published a massive 3-volume study of a number of Asian nations entitled Asian Drama, an inquiry into the poverty of nations. Internationally revered as a father figure of social policy, Myrdal contributed to social democratic thinking throughout the world. In collaboration with friends and colleagues in the political and academic arenas, Myrdal was a strong advocate of socialism and globalism. He wrote about the need to move from the welfare state, redistribution by the state of wealth among citizens, to a welfare world, redistribution of wealth among nations by a world government. Myrdal was the opposite end of the political spectrum from Hayek. The fact that they were chosen to share the 1974 Nobel Prize raised eyebrows at the time, suggesting behind-the-scenes political maneuvering among the selection committee members. Trade cycle theory. Hayek's ratings spanned 7 decades. He was professionally active throughout most of his adult life, and he contributed to a variety of disciplines, among them economics, political philosophy, psychology, the history of ideas, and the philosophy and methodology of the social sciences. Hayek was also controversial. A member of the Austrian School of Economics, he was part of a tradition that was marginalized politically and generally dismissed by the economics community for about 50 years, starting in the 1930s. Hayek's oldest contribution was his development of the business cycle theory that built on the earlier work by Swedish economists Knut Wicksell and von Mises. Hayek's theory posits the natural interest rate as an intemporal price, that is, a price that coordinates the decisions of savers and investors through time. The cycle occurs when the market rate of interest, that is, the one prevailing in the market, diverges from this natural rate of interest. This causes the structure of the capital stock to become distorted, so that it no longer reflects the desires of savers and investors as expressed in the market. His theory had the unfortunate policy implication that attempts to counteract a recession or period of high unemployment with an increase in the money supplied will further distort the structure of the capital stock. His remedy was simply to allow the recession to play itself out, thereby permitting the market rate to return to the natural rate. Hayek's analysis of the role of assumptions about knowledge in economic theories is highly regarded by economists. Hayek began developing his ideas during the 1930s, when the static equilibrium theories of the day were full information models. In other words, they assume that all agents have access to the same objectively correct information. Hayek believed that such models fail to eliminate the role of market prices in providing information to market participants. Critique of socialism and the defense of classical liberal institutions. Throughout his life, Hayek criticized socialism, often contrasting it with a system of free markets. Although his early critiques were based on economic grounds, he later drew upon political, ethical, and other arguments to make his case. In 1944, Hayek published The Road to Serfdom, which was destined to be his most famous book and to make him an international academic star the following year, when it was serialized in the hugely popular American magazine Reader's Digest. The book argued that socialism in all its forms inevitably leads to repression and dictatorship from the simple reason that radical egalitarianism violates essential features of human nature, as it can be implemented only by means of violence, i.e. a police state. In 1960, during his Chicago years, Hayek published what is surely his masterpiece, The Constitution of Liberty. This weighty tome is a widely ranging and deeply probing philosophical analysis of the liberal democratic political order along its social, economic, legal, and political dimensions. The limits of social sciences. Even in his early writings, Hayek stressed the limited role of empirical work in economics. This was due in part to his affiliation with the Austrian school, whose work had been shaped by a battle over methods, Methodenstreit, with the German historical school of economists at the turn of the 20th century. The Austrian side had insisted that a theoretical, as opposed to a purely empirical, approach to social sciences was both possible and fruitful, and that all observation presupposed an underlying theoretical framework. In later decades, the Austrian economists opposed the ascendance of positivist and other radically empiricist doctrines within the philosophy of science. As with all of his work, Hayek's methodological ideas were formed against the backdrop of intense debates over the viability and appropriateness of alternative political and economic systems. His best ideas transcend the circumstances of their formation. If Hayek has a legacy, one part is a constant reminder that human knowledge is limited and that an understanding of this limitation is the first step toward wisdom. Another part of his message is that many social institutions persist precisely because they enable people to survive and prosper in a world in which knowledge is limited, and that attempts to create institutions anew, often undertaken with the best of intentions, have been the cause of much human misery. The legacy of Gunnar Myrdal is in his having posed in very important ways two central questions. First, the explanations of and practical solutions for racism and underdevelopment. Two, the relationship between the scientist and his valuations and the objects of scientific inquiry. His legacy as a social scientist and economist continues to be felt today. His work on race relations and social policy influenced the civil rights movement in the United States and the development of the modern welfare state in Sweden. Myrdal's idea on social reform and government intervention continue to be relevant in today's debates on inequality and social justice. His legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of rigorous research and analysis in the pursuit of social progress. In most of his principal works, Hayek succeeds in communicating to the reader an urgent sense that the ideas he is discussing are vitally important, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of defending human freedom and improving the human condition generally. Hayek shared the Nobel Prize with Gunnar Myrdal in 1974, in one of the more controversial and surprising awards ever made. Controversial because Myrdal had called for the abolition of the Nobel Prize as a result of it having been awarded to Hayek and Friedman. Unsurprising, for at that time Hayek was virtually forgotten in the economics profession. Interest in Hayek and his work increased after the 1974 award, his novel speech being a reiteration of his counter-revolution thesis, and has kept on that track until today, his stock being enormously boosted by the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. How two contradictory theoretical positions were awarded is a good sign of what the honest seek for truth is about. Those two perspectives cohabit nowadays, and those two incide at the basis for political decisions about how to run a country, and we know we are affected by those decisions. Which emphasis is better is for you to decide. So, now you can have a better perspective of its importance.